Hello, my name is Kuljit Bhamra, and in this episode I'll be presenting some tips and helpful advice for those of you that would like to purchase a tabla set. And especially if you're someone who wants to purchase a second-hand tabla set online from eBay, for example, these tips I hope will be very helpful to you. I've divided the episode into two main categories. Firstly, we'll look at the visible features of the drum. And then secondly, we'll look at the tone and sound quality of the tabla. Now, of course, the two are related very strongly because if there is something visibly wrong with the tabla, like for example, there's something missing or there's something broken, obviously it's going to affect the tonal quality. But let's just look at them one by one. Now, the main reason I'm talking about these tips and things to look out for is I have seen many enthusiastic students who wanted to learn to play the tabla, and they've gone out and bought a set of tablas straight away, and they come back and they'll play the tabla and they'll go, oh, it's not sounding, so I'll practice and practice my technique, but you know what, I don't think I'm ever going to be good at tabla, and I'll leave it to the other people. I have seen that with my own eyes, and I think that's a very big shame that happens, because it's not the technique or the bad technique of the student, it's the drum that's bad. Now, of course, if you go to a shop and buy a guitar, or maybe you buy an object online, you would assume that it's going to have, you assume that it's going to work, and you assume that it's going to work well. You wouldn't think something would be faulty unless, you know, if you buy something on eBay, it does say parts only or it doesn't work. Whereas with tabla, this one, for example, the person selling it may say something like, tabla for sale, small hole in drum head, but sounds great. Now, I'm not having a dig at that person, but this actually does sound great. That's not a bad sound. That's actually quite an interesting sound. But if I played you this, that's an interesting sound also, and it sounds great. And that's how this tabla should sound. So I really am trying to help those people who'd like to get into the tabla world, because there's no way of really knowing until you've bought the tabla and got them at home, and then you may still not know that the tabla is to blame rather than your technique. So I'm going to start off by reminding ourselves what a normal tabla set looks like when all the bits are in place. The tabla is always a two-piece drum. There is a smaller drum, which is made of wood, and a larger drum which is made of metal. So the first thing to say is, if you're buying a second-hand tabla online and there's only one drum, that means it's not a full set. I've also seen tabla sets advertised online where there are two of the same one. There are two small ones, or there's two of the big ones. Again, that should raise your alarm bells. Always go for a set where there's a smaller wooden one and a larger metal one. Now, let's look at the physical aspects and the things to look out for when it comes to the tabla. On the wooden drum, because it's wooden, it is prone to cracking or splitting. So the first thing to look out for on the shell of the drum are any cracks or splits. Now, I have to tell you a very quick story actually while I'm remembering this. My friend Kaz Coronel, who is a singer and a DJ and a musician, bought a set of tablas in India. And when she brought them back to the UK, to her shock, it was making a chirping sound. And her and her partner were trying to figure out where this sound was coming from. It was almost clockwork. Then they realised that there must be an insect inside of the drum. And Of course, they fantasized about it being maybe a snake or it could be a scorpion. But anyway, I'll cut the story short. This insect that was making this chirping sound inside the drum was in there for 3 months. And in a sort of amusing way, it also provided a sort of metronome for Kaz. So when she was practicing, she was playing along to the sound of the chirping. So one day she came back from work and looked at her tabla set, and there was a hole in the side of the drum. And of course, oh my God, this creature had escaped and was wild in her flat somewhere. So they spent quite a bit of time looking for this scorpion or this creature. And then one of them noticed on the edge of the drum was sitting a beetle. Sadly, it died soon after, and it had spent most of its life eating its way out of the tabla shell. I know that's a weird story, but nevertheless, the things to look out for are definitely holes in the body of the drum and also cracks. On the larger drum, what I would look out for are any dents in the metal. Now, if I was to drop this drum, which I'm not going to do, or if the two drums were together in a case and they collided with each other because of impact, it would cause a dent in the drum. Now, even though perhaps the dent is not going to affect the sound quality too much, I would prefer to go for a drum without any dents in it. So that's the physical side to do with the body. Let's talk a bit more about the other bits of the tabla and the other components that make it sound good. One of the most distinguishing features of the tabla drum are these black spots on the drum. Each drum must have a black paste spot on it. So, of course, if you see a set of tablas for sale and they don't have spots on them, then don't buy them because they're not going to sound good. Now, there is one exception to the rule, and I'd like to show you something which is unusual, but it's good to know that it exists. There are some makers of tabla that have decided to put the spot on the underside of the drum head. Now, I'm not sure what the reason for that is, and I'm not going to go there, but they sound good. These are very rare, actually, and quite unusual to find. I personally wouldn't necessarily choose a drum like this, and I'd be worried whether if the paste came loose, it would start to crumb or start to rattle inside the drum. So just to make you aware that there are drums without spots, but most likely if you see a set of drums, especially second-hand tabla drums for sale, and they haven't got spots, it means there were spots and they've disappeared. Now, the other thing with spots also to be aware of is, if you look at this drum, for example, and this drum here, you can see that parts of the spots have eroded, and this has become damaged. Someone's either hit it with a drumstick or with a hammer, or it's just flaked off due to misuse. Look out for that. That is a big problem for two reasons. Firstly, when you play the drum, it can actually damage your hand because it's a sharp edge, it can cut you. And secondly, it causes the drum to sound bad. Now, that's very evident that there are bits of the black spot missing. Sometimes it's not as evident. And sometimes the black spots have become worn. And the black spot actually is made up of many individual crystalline crumbs of paste. Sometimes the little individual crumbs, they pop out during playing and they make a rattling, buzzy sound. Now, incidentally, you may have noticed also that there is a hole in this drum. So look out for things like that. This is going to be really obvious, this one, but this one's got a larger hole in it. So if you see a drum like this, don't buy it. Now, you may think that you are a handy person, and I'm not disputing whether you are or not, but you may think to yourself, oh, well, these drums are very cheap, and all it needs is a new head on it, and I think I can do that. Well, it's very hard to put a new head on a tabla shell. For a variety of reasons. Firstly, it's very difficult to get the correct size of head. Many makers say that our tablas are 5.5-inch diameter or 5.25, when actually, if you measure them accurately, you'll find out that they're maybe 4.75 or not exactly what they say they are. So you may go out and buy a spare head to replace your broken one, and then it's not going to fit. That's the first thing. The second thing that happens is the process of actually putting this head on is laborious, and it is a specialist process. Not everyone can do it. Now, if you look closely at this, there are tensioning straps on the drum. In fact, it's one strap, 10 meters long approximately, that goes all the way through. It's threaded into the drum head, and then it goes underneath and it's threaded through another hoop at the bottom, and then it comes back up again. And it's a very laborious process to actually change the drum head. I mean, compared to a Western drum, for example, this is a Western drum, which is part of a drum kit. You can see here that there is a standardized drum head. I'm sure if I went out to get a spare drum head for this, it would fit exactly because it's got a brand name on it. Plus, drum shells tend to be standardized in their diameter dimensions. Also, I could remove this drum head in, I don't know, 2 or 3 minutes by just undoing these 4 bolts. The drum head would come off. I could get a new drum head, replace it, and within 10 minutes, I would say you would have a new drum head ready to go. With a tabla, it will take about 3 hours to rethread a drum head. I know I'm going to get some comments now from people saying, "Sir, I can do it in 45 minutes." Well, that's great if you can. It's difficult to find people like you all over the world. So this would take me about 2 to 3 hours to rethread the drum head. Then it needs to settle down. Then I need to insert the chocks. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then I need to balance the drum head and tune it so the tension is equally distributed. That is a very long, tedious and specialist process. So I urge you not to go down the route of, oh, I'll buy these cheap tablas and I'll just get the head replaced. It's not going to be that easy. Another feature, obvious feature of the tabla drum is that they have these chocks, these wooden chocks, which we call gatte or gatta as a singular. And these chocks are placed underneath the straps to create tension. There are always 8 chocks on the smaller drum, always. So if you see a drum and 1 or 2 of these are missing, it means it's not all there, firstly. Secondly, it could mean that the drum has been left with an unbalanced tension in the head. Now, that could be more of a serious problem because you can imagine this drum shell is circular and the tension is equal around the drum. In fact, if I play the drum around the rim, you'll hear that the note is the same all the way around, and that's because the tension is equally distributed. If I was to remove 1 or more of these chocks, that would mean that the tension has become eccentric. Now, that may not be a problem, but actually I think it is, because firstly, it will create eccentric tension on the drum head. Secondly, what it could do is it could warp the drum shell, because this is a hollow shell which is circular, and if the tension is pulled stronger on one axis rather than another one, it will cause the drum to warp. And I've seen many drums that when you look at them, they don't look circular, they look oval. Now, let me just go back to this drum here, which has split, obviously. You could argue with me that the shell is still circular, which it may be if it's a good solid wood. But I would say that after time, this would start to become oval. So sometimes there are drums that are intact and it doesn't look like the drum head has split. But when you look at them, you just say to yourself, that doesn't look round to me. that black spot doesn't look in the middle and it looks like it's stretched that way. That is a big warning sign, and I would have alarm bells going off in my head if I saw that, because it would mean I would never be able to tune it properly. Because when I buy a replacement head, it's obviously going to be round, and then it's not going to be distributed equally tension-wise, and that will cause a problem. Now, whilst on the subject of chocks, you may notice that my larger drum also has little chocks in it. It's unusual for the larger drum to have chocks. I'm calling this a larger drum. In India, people call this a baya, and they call the smaller drum a daya. I prefer not to use that terminology because in India, daya means right and baya means left. So if you're sitting in a taxi cab in India and you want him to or her to turn left, you will say baya, daya. Now, that's all good, except if you're left-handed, then it becomes very complicated. So suddenly you're playing the daya with your left hand, which is, I think, is confusing. So I like to say larger drum and smaller drum. But getting back onto the subject of chocks, this larger drum has a much lower pitch and has a lower tension in the drum. And because of the low tensioning of the drum, it does sometimes go out of tune, and if it goes below its threshold of tuning, it doesn't sound at all. So I've put these little rods and these little chocks under the straps so I can adjust the tension. And in fact, I'll show you if I loosen them all off. They make very little difference, but enough difference to make a big difference, if that makes any sense. So if I loosen them down now, you can even see how loose the skin is from me depressing it. That's still working, but just giving it a bit of a increase in tension will increase the resonance of the drum. So there you are. So these are not essential, and sometimes the larger drums do have them. Usually they have about 4, if at all, but I wouldn't worry too much about these being an essential part of the tabla set. Now, let's look at the straps on these drums. So this is a tensioning strap that I mentioned earlier on. We call it baddi, B-A-D-D-I, if you spell it in English. And as I mentioned earlier on, it's a one-piece strap that's about 10 meters long. And I would look out for any knots in this tensioning strap. Now, what happens sometimes is when people tune their drums, they accidentally hit the strap and it wears it down, and sometimes it snaps. Also, sometimes when people tension their drums, the straps snap. And a very quick fix for that is to tie a knot in it. And actually, it's not that quick because you have to soak this. It's very stiff. When it becomes pliable, you tie a knot, then you've got to retension the whole drum. But that is a fix. The problem with putting a knot in a drum is once the knot is in, if I wanted to redistribute the tension on the drum, I'd have a problem because the knot will be in the way of getting through the hoop, and it might even get in the way of this chock. So look out for knots or broken straps. Avoid that completely. Now, in this drum over here, I want to show you the bottom side of this drum. And you can see that the hoop is not round. You can see very clearly that over here there is a stronger tension than there is elsewhere. And in fact, the straps have gathered together at this point because it's become a sort of angular shape where there's excess tension on this side. Now, that would also raise an alarm bell for me, because that would indicate to me that the tension in this drum is not distributed equally. That could be fixed, but again, it's a specialist job. I also look out for that same feature on the smaller drum. So I would, on this bottom hoop, I would just check to see that it's circular and that it's not touching the central hub of the base of the shell. Because if the shell is taking some of the tension, it means the tension is not inherent and it's not distributed in the straps. By the way, I've just noticed This one's got a knot in it. So this one fails on two accounts, the knot and the broken head. So I wasn't aware of that before, so look out for things like that. Great, okay. So what should come with your tabla set are 2 resting cushions. And here is an example of 2 resting cushions. Now, there's a couple of things I want to say about these, and they're my opinion, but I really believe that they would make a big difference to your playing. I would urge you to make sure that the larger drum has a larger ring cushion than the smaller one. So if I just show you the one I've got here. This is my larger ring for the... Now this stops the drum from rocking around, because as you can see, the base of this drum is almost like an apex of a dome. So it needs a larger diameter ring to stop it from rocking. Whereas the smaller side, put this back, the smaller drum only needs a smaller diameter cushion. Now, the other thing about cushions for me also is they can get really heavy. Now, if you're someone like me who wants to travel abroad for concerts and you travel in a plane quite a bit, well, weight is really important. This one here, which is the same size as the lower one, is actually quite a bit heavier. This is very light, as you can see. So I would, again, if it's important to you, persuade you to get lighter cushions that are very firm but light, and then it will save you 3 kilograms of baggage when you travel abroad. Now, another thing you get with your tabla set is a tuning hammer, and this is used to tune the drum. I'm not going to tune the tabla in this episode. There is another episode about tuning. But I would urge you, well, first of all, to make sure that you have a tuning hammer. Secondly, if you've got children in the house, do not keep the hammer close to the drums for obvious reasons. Also, if you're a classroom teacher and you have tablas in the classroom, keep the hammer away in a safe place, away from the students, because obviously it will end in disaster. One hit from the hammer on the drum head will render the drums useless completely, and they'll need reheading again. Another thing that comes with your tabla set are protective covers, and invariably what you'll get is a soft cover similar to this, which covers your tabla and protects it from dust, which is all great, but I don't think a soft cover would protect your tabla from anything falling on it. If a sharp object fell on it, like a microphone or a microphone stand, I think it would puncture the drum head. So I would persuade you, if possible, to choose a cover that is hard. This one's made of board, some sort of hardboard or cardboard, but this definitely would protect the tabla from sharp objects falling on it and puncturing it. So if you had a choice of floppy or a hard one, I'd go for the hard hat. Okay, now let's talk about the sound quality and the tuning of the tabla. Tabla comes in many pitches. You can't just get one set of tabla and assume that you can tune it to any key. In fact, it would have a preferred pitch that it comes in. The shopkeeper or the seller will tell you which pitch this tabla was optimized for. And then once you know that, I think it would go a tone either way very safely and no more. This drum, for example, is tuned to an F. I could probably take that to a G, not a G sharp. If I went too tight, it would split the skin. If I slackened the tensioning ropes in order to take it down to a C, it just wouldn't sound at all. It would be so loose that it wouldn't sound. Now, whereas this drum over here, this is my A tabla, because it's tuned to an A. This could go down to a G, maybe an F, and up to a B. I wouldn't take this tabla to a C, because I'd be worried about splitting the skin and over tensioning it. So it's really important to know yourself which pitch you would like your tabla to be tuned to, because that would decide which tabla you buy. Now, pitch may not matter to you. You may be someone who just wants to play tabla on your own, and therefore the pitch doesn't really have to match another instrument. And so the choice is entirely yours. Or if you're a musician that's playing with a singer or another instrumentalist, find out what pitch would be preferred, because most likely the singer or the other musician will play in a particular key, and that's the key you'd need to choose when buying your tabla. Of course, when you buy tablas second-hand online or elsewhere, the seller may not know what the pitch is. So it's a bit of a gamble, and you can be lucky and get a good set of second-hand tablas online, but I would say there's a strong risk element involved of not only the physical quality but also the tonal quality. Staying on the subject of tuning, I'm just going to point out an observation that I've made on this particular tabla. As I mentioned earlier on, these straps are raised on the chocks to increase tension. Now, one thing that sticks out obviously to me about this drum is all 4 straps have been lifted up onto the chock, which indicates to me that the drum is already at its top level of tuning. I couldn't get this drum to go any higher, I don't think. Whereas this one here, which is my F tabla, only has 1 strap raised. If I wanted to take it to a G, I might need to lift another strap up onto the chocks. Now, if we look at this previous drum that I showed you, I can see, if I look at the profile of the drum, can you see that this plaited rim is very low compared to the top surface of the drum? So it's about 10 millimeters below the top surface, which again indicates to me that this drum, well, this drum head is gone because it's got a hole in it anyway. But let's assume that the hole's not there. I would be able to tell straight away that this drum has reached its limit of tension, or is very close to reaching its limit of tension, even though it's only got 2 straps raised on top of the chocks. That would again ring alarm bells in my head. In the category of good tablas, there is also a range, and some tabla makers and tabla shops, they have their own ways of indicating the level of goodness in the good category. Some people call tablas a concert model, some would call a tabla set a professional model, some would call a tabla set a student model. Now, what are the differences between all those 3? Well, I think the differences are minor because they're all good, but one example of a difference would be you may end up having a copper large drum rather than a steel large drum. Now, what's the difference? Well, sometimes it's difficult to discern a difference when you play the drums, but generally the copper ones are heavier, and for that reason they have a better projection of sound. Again, we're talking about the difference between good and very good here, so this may not affect you if you're a new person to the world. I would like to point out also that when you buy a steel drum, there are 2 types. There is mild steel and there is stainless steel. So why do you need to know that? Well, if you buy a mild steel set, it could be prone to rusting if you live in a humid country or if you live in a damp area. So I would avoid mild steel and ask for a stainless steel set. Otherwise, if you're living in a stable environment with stable humidity and temperature, then it doesn't matter. But to be honest, the differences between a good quality set and a very good quality set are small. Sometimes people offer extra accessories with a more expensive set. But I think the point of this video is to enable you to avoid buying a bad set. Because if you get a bad set of tabla, it will be very difficult to play, and you may end up blaming yourself and eventually giving up altogether. Thank you very much for watching. I hope that was helpful to you, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.